Speak Amazon domain name equals news greater than atmospheric shots of old, weathered maps. A quill pen scratching on parchment. The flicker of candlelight in a dark, stone room. It is the largest real estate deal in history. 828,000 square miles of land. Purchased for pennies on the acre. The year is 1803. The United States of America has just doubled in size. This is the story we are all taught. A story of shrewd diplomacy. A story of American destiny. But that story is a carefully constructed lie. The truth is far more complex. It is a story of secret deals. A story of revolution and disease. And it is a story of a president forced to betray his most sacred principles. This is the past, exposed. It all begins with a river. The Mississippi. For American farmers in the West, this river was a lifeline. It was their only route to the sea. Their only way to sell their grain and goods to the world. And the gateway to that river was a single city. New Orleans. A simple hand-drawn map showing the Ohio and Mississippi rivers flowing down to the port of New Orleans. For years, a treaty with Spain guaranteed America's right to use the port. But in 1801, a secret reached Washington, D.C., a secret that sent a wave of panic through the government. Spain had ceded the vast Louisiana territory back to France. And France was now controlled by one man. Napoleon Bonaparte. A portrait of a stern, ambitious Napoleon Bonaparte. In the White House, President Thomas Jefferson was deeply alarmed. Jefferson was a man of contradictions. A scholar and a farmer. A revolutionary and a slave owner. Above all, he was a strict constructionist. He believed the federal government had only the powers explicitly written in the Constitution. And the Constitution said nothing about acquiring foreign land. Close up on a copy of the U.S. Constitution. The page is stark and clear. But Napoleon in control of New Orleans was an existential threat. He could choke off America's economy at will. Jefferson feared war was inevitable. He wrote a desperate letter. The day that France takes possession of New Orleans, we must marry ourselves to the British fleet and nation. For Jefferson, an alliance with his former enemy was unthinkable. He needed another option. A quill pen scratches frantically across parchment. The words are filled with urgency. He dispatched his friend, James Monroe, to Paris. Monroe's mission was simple. And urgent. He was to join the American minister, Robert Livingston. Their instructions were clear. Buy New Orleans. And perhaps a small part of Florida. They were authorized to offer up to $10 million. James Monroe boards a sailing ship. The seas are rough. The journey will take weeks. In Paris, Livingston had already been trying to negotiate. He was stonewalled at every turn. He dealt with Napoleon's cunning foreign minister, Talleyrand. A man famous for his duplicity. Livingston was getting nowhere. Then, one evening, everything changed. Talleyrand casually asked an unbelievable question. What would America give for the whole of Louisiana? A lavish Parisian ballroom. Talleyrand leans in, whispering to a stunned Livingston. Livingston was speechless. This was not part of the plan. The entire territory? An empire stretching from the Mississippi to the Rocky Mountains. It was an offer beyond his wildest imagination. Days later, Monroe arrived in Paris. Napoleon's minister made the offer official. $15 million. For all of it. Monroe and Livingston were in an impossible position. They had no authority to accept. Communication with Washington took months by sea. But Napoleon's offer was on the table now. And it would not wait. It was an offer that was too good to be true. And it was a deal that could destroy their president. Why? Why would Napoleon Bonaparte, the most powerful man in Europe, give up an empire? The textbook answer is simple. He needed money for his coming war with Great Britain. This is true. But it is not the whole truth. To find the real reason, we must look thousands of miles from Paris. To a small island in the Caribbean. Saint-Domingue. Transition from the cold, stone halls of Paris to the lush, tropical landscape of Haiti. Today, we call it Haiti. In 1802, it was France's most profitable colony. A brutal engine of wealth, powered by sugar and slavery. But Saint-Domingue was in flames. Its enslaved population had risen up. They were led by a brilliant, self-educated former slave. A man named Toussaint Louverture. A powerful, dignified portrait of Toussaint Louverture. Louverture had forged an army of rebels. They defeated the Spanish and the British. They created the first free black republic in the world. This was an intolerable affront to Napoleon. But the island was more than just a matter of pride. It was the keystone of his entire plan for the New World. A map showing Saint-Domingue as the hub, with trade routes connecting to Louisiana. Napoleon's grand design was simple. Louisiana would be the breadbasket. A vast farm, producing food to supply the rich sugar plantations of Saint-Domingue. First, he had to retake the island. He sent his own brother-in-law, Charles Leclerc, with an army of over 40,000 veteran soldiers. The largest transatlantic force ever assembled. French warships fill a tropical harbor. Thousands of soldiers in European uniforms disembark. At first, the French were successful. They captured Toussaint Louverture through trickery. He was shipped to a cold prison in the French mountains, where he would die. But the rebellion did not die with him. And then, a new enemy appeared. One far deadlier than any rebel army. Yellow fever. A French soldier in a sweat-soaked uniform collapses. The mood is one of sickness and despair. The disease ripped through the French ranks. Soldiers died by the thousands. Leclerc himself succumbed to the fever. His final letters to Napoleon were filled with desperation. He wrote of the rebels, "We must destroy all the Negroes of the mountains. And not leave a child over 12 years of age." But it was too late. The French army was annihilated. This was the first domino to fall. With Saint-Domingue lost, Napoleon's new world dream was dead. The Louisiana Territory was now strategically useless to him. It was no longer a breadbasket. It was a massive, indefensible liability. A map of North America. The British Royal Navy emblem appears, menacingly, in the Atlantic. This was the second domino. War with Britain was about to resume. Napoleon knew the British Royal Navy ruled the seas. He could not possibly defend a port as remote as New Orleans. He knew the British would seize at the moment war was declared. His logic was cold and ruthless. Better to sell the land to the weak Americans than lose it for free to his greatest enemy. Return to Paris. Monroe and Livingston in a tense, candlelit room. Back in Paris, Monroe and Livingston understood the stakes. They had to act. There was no time to wait for Jefferson's permission. They were diplomats, not plenipotentiaries. They were about to spend a sum that was larger than the entire federal budget. They were acting completely outside their authority. On April 30, 1803, they agreed to the deal. A secret treaty was signed. They had just bought an empire. And they could only pray the president wouldn't disown them for it. The news reached Washington in July. Jefferson was stunned. He had sought a city and received a continent. It was a geopolitical triumph beyond his wildest dreams. But it was also a constitutional nightmare. Jefferson in his study, pacing, wrestling with his conscience. This was the man who had built his career on limiting federal power. He had raged against his political foes for stretching the Constitution's meaning. Now, he was faced with a choice. Uphold his principles and reject the deal. Or betray those principles and secure the nation's future. He tried to find a way out. He drafted a constitutional amendment to authorize the purchase. But his advisors warned him there was no time. Napoleon could change his mind. A calendar, the pages flipping forward, creating a sense of urgency. In the end, Jefferson folded. He put aside his constitutional scruples. He argued the purchase was a matter of national security. A guardian, he said, must sometimes act outside the law to save his charge. It was a breathtaking act of political pragmatism. And it was his first great compromise. He pushed the treaty through the Senate. On October 20, 1803, it was ratified. The United States had doubled in size. An American flag with 15 stars is raised over New Orleans, replacing the French tricolor. But this victory cast long, dark shadows. It created new and dangerous problems. The first was the expansion of slavery. Southern slaveholders saw the new territory not as a land of liberty, but as a vast, new frontier for cotton and sugar. A new empire for slavery. The purchase set the stage for decades of bitter conflict. The Missouri Compromise. The Kansas-Nebraska Act. It drew the battle lines that would eventually lead to the Civil War. A map showing the Louisiana Purchase territory, with a dividing line drawn across it, separating future slave and free states. And there was one final, hidden truth. A truth that is the darkest legacy of the deal. The land was never truly Napoleon's to sell. He had only purchased a claim from Spain. A claim on paper. The territory was, in fact, home to dozens of sovereign indigenous nations. The Sioux. The Cheyenne. The Arapaho. The Osage. Portraits or historical drawings of Native American leaders from the affected tribes. They knew nothing of the treaty signed in Paris. Their land, their homes, and their way of life had been sold from under them. By a French emperor who had never seen it. To an American president who had never been there. The Louisiana Purchase was not a simple real estate transaction. It was the purchase of an imperial claim. A claim the United States would spend the next 100 years enforcing. Often, with violence and forced removal. A wide, Epic shot of the untouched American West. The landscape is beautiful, but a shadow slowly creeps across it. The greatest land deal in history was a paradox. It was a stroke of diplomatic genius born from desperation. It was secured by a slave revolt half a world away. It forced a president to sacrifice his ideals for the nation's good. And it guaranteed America's rise as a continental power. By setting it on a course for civil war. And by dispossessing the people who had lived there for centuries. It was America's greatest triumph. Built on a foundation of secrets, compromises, and untold truths. Less than /Amazon domain/speak.